Podcasting has become a huge industry, and it seems that everywhere you turn, somebody is starting up their own podcast. It seems that everybody that you know at this point is starting one. And you want to know the reason for that? Is because they understand that it's easy to do, it's easy to build up a brand that way, it provides huge credibility, and it brings in a ton of business. So today I'll show you how simple it is and how to actually start up a podcast without breaking the bank and without spending countless of hours trying to figure it out. Hey, it's Jaime. If you're just meeting, welcome to the channel that brings actionable content to grow your business through online marketing. So if that sounds beneficial, consider subscribing. Okay, so I broke down the flow of this video into 3 different phases. 1 is preparing for the podcast strategically, and then 2 is preparing for the podcast physically. In other words, what you're going to physically need. And then 3 is the actual process of creating your podcast, uploading it, and distributing it. And that starts off with understanding who you're trying to serve. You need to identify the audience that you're going after. So this means you identifying the exact person that you're trying to reach, the exact person that you're trying to help. Which leads us into the next point. You need a problem to solve. You can certainly create a podcast and just talk about anything and everything, but at the end of the day, if you're doing the podcast as a hobby, that's going to work. But if you're doing a podcast with the intention of driving business, then you need to have a strategy, and you need to define the problem that you're having and the person that you're trying to reach. So with real estate specifically, you need to understand the consumer. There's only so many times that you can share on a podcast how to buy a house and how to sell a house. You need to have a bit more depth to that. You need to explain the process long before they get pre-qualified and long after they're homeowners in order to have a longevity to your podcast. So that depth allows for different types of people to join your podcast and become aware of your podcast, because you're going to speak to people in different stages of a buying process. Some folks will never buy a house, but they're going to be active listeners just because of all of the value information that you provide. But again, if you use the podcast as a driver of business and are intentional with your strategy, you will get people reaching out to you to help them buy and help them sell, regardless of where they are in the country. So once you've identified your audience and identified the problem that you're trying to solve for, then you want to brainstorm 3 to 5 different topics that you want to cover in the first 3 to 5 episodes. And there's several reasons for you doing this brainstorming. 1, it's going to help you create the title of your podcast. And then 2, it's going to help you create momentum with your podcast, because what's worse than starting a podcast is forgetting about it and not doing it, so not following through. So this momentum will drive you to that 3rd episode, the 4th episode, the 5th, and on and on. And then also, this brainstorming exercise is going to help you determine if you have a large enough problem. Are you wide enough with your topic, or are you too niche down to where you're going to quickly run out of ideas? And something else you need to consider strategically is, are you going to be a solo podcaster, or are you going to have a co-host? Because that makes a huge difference on how you set things up, and also it makes a huge difference on the topics that you want to cover. All right, so now that we're thinking through strategically and are preparing our podcast from the strategic side, let's prepare the podcast from the physical side, what you're going to actually physically need in order to execute on this podcast. So first, you're going to need a recording device. If you're going to use your laptop or a camera, make sure that you have an external microphone, because the microphones that are in your camera and also in your laptop just aren't going to cut it. Now, you can also use your phone with some earpieces, but that's up to your discretion. If you're able to make calls and people are able to hear you clearly, then it's probably okay. But at the end of the day, I do suggest that you don't skimp out on the audio, because basically the podcast is an audio format. So the crispier the quality, the better. And if you're going to have multiple people on your podcast, you need to figure this out very quickly, how you're going to actually record, because unless you're in the same room, it involves a different software. That involves you either using Skype to record or Zoom to record, or some sort of online mechanism that gives you a good quality of audio as a final product. Another piece to the puzzle is going to be software to edit your podcast. You can use the free software that comes with all computers, regardless if it's PC or Mac, or you can use more professional grade editors like Final Cut Pro or Premiere. I know that those are more for video, but they work just fine. Something else that you need to design that is often forgot is the cover art for the podcast. You can either design it yourself or use software like Canva, which is free to use, or you can go to places like Fiverr and have somebody design that podcast cover for you. I know Fiverr isn't as sexy as it once used to be, but the goal is to get started and eliminate roadblocks, and also we don't want to break the budget. Another item that you want to create and outsource if you need to is creating an intro to your podcast. At this point, podcasting is becoming more and more mature, so there is a rhythm to them that most people expect. And most people expect for you to have an intro to your podcast, so you should have one. And the next thing that you need is something that most people are not aware even exists unless you create your own podcast, and that is a host. You need a website to host your podcast. And there's several that you can use, but I highly suggest Buzzsprout. Buzzsprout is easy to use. It distributes to all major podcast platforms, aka directories. It's inexpensive, and the link is down below. And once you're on Buzzsprout, you want to open up accounts with all directories. You want to open accounts with Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Amazon Music, and everyone that will have your podcast. This one feature alone that allowed me to publish and create accounts in all of these different directories was well worth the investment in Buzzsprout. It made it so easy. Okay, so everything that we just covered is the absolute basic. This is what you need. Yes, you can get a ton more sophisticated if you absolutely want, but don't overcomplicate it. Just start and improve as you go. All right, now we've covered preparing for the podcast strategically, preparing for the podcast physically. Now we need to cover the process. But before we do, won't you just smash like down there? That's gonna really make my day. All right, so let's jump into the process. Let's jump into the flow, because this is where the money is made, literally. First, you need to plan out your title, and you also need to plan out the flow of the podcast. Yes, you can riff it, you can just fly from the seat of your pants, but at the end of the day, you want people to not only listen to you once, but listen to you twice, 3 times, 4 times. In other words, you want people coming back. And if you're too scatterbrained, it's just not going to work. So think of a catchy title, think of a template that you want to follow, and also have some talking points so you're not left scrambling for thoughts and ideas while you're on the podcast. And then second, you're going to record the podcast. And then third, you want to edit the podcast. So make sure that you embed the intro at this time along with the content that you just recorded. And then fourth, you're going to upload to Buzzsprout, which is going to distribute your podcast to every directory that you signed up for. And then lastly, you're going to promote your podcast. Now here's a pro tip. Sign up for Plink, which is a way to create smart links for your podcast. So if somebody has Android versus Apple phones, it'll direct them to the appropriate place to download your podcast. It's super cool and only requires one link. And that's it. I know it sounds like a lot, but it really isn't. If you've been thinking about getting into podcasting, now is the absolute best time to get started. You don't have the option of getting started 3 years ago because that was in your mind back then, but you do have the option of getting started today, and I encourage you to take that opportunity. And trust that everything that we talked about is linked down below. And if you want my template, the cheat sheet that you absolutely need to get started with your podcast that summarizes everything that we just talked about and then some, then go ahead and shoot me an email and I will gladly make that available to you. All right, so now that you know how simple it is to start your own real estate podcast, you might be interested in driving traffic to it by running some ads. So I'll leave a video right here that's gonna help you do that. Also, if you found value today, please be sure to subscribe and turn on that notification bell so you don't miss another video. And of course, make it your best day yet.